Okay, we're going to take a look at 3.8 Napoleon's rise and fall in this particular video, or maybe a set of videos, depending on how long is needed for this. It's a little bit complicated. So some of this we'll end up covering it in class. This covers we're going to strictly focus on the 3.8 guided reading. You see in front of me that I have the map of Napoleon's Europe and what it looks like at its peak. These were areas that either the purple, and you can clearly see this in your text. These were areas that were ran by Napoleon, dependent on France, or allied with Napoleon at one time. With battle sites in between. So at his height, Napoleon was and France were quite strong in the late 1700s and early 1800s, up until his fall in 1815. So let's take a look at quickly, and I think I'm going to show this in class too, so I'm not going to spend too much time with it. Basically, people turned to Napoleon because they had lost confidence in a government called the Directory that had a 5-member head and a 2-house legislature, basically a constitutional monarchy. But it after Robespierre's reign of terror and after he had gone too far. Well, Napoleon really, what he does is he names himself, he holds a plebiscite, a vote of his people to approve his rule, stages kind of a coup d'etat, and eventually names himself the First Council. So while there was a council with a plebiscite, but he actually, what ends up happening is that he really just ends up naming himself First Consul and ultimately dictator. So this sets the stage for what he did, which eventually conquers Austria, Prussia, Portugal, and Spain, and attempts to unify Europe under French rule. There was a problem. The biggest issue was, of course, getting one of the major issues was getting Great Britain under control, and that was not going to be easy. And in fact, the continental system was attempted to weaken England, and it didn't work. The continental system basically forced England and forced supplies to be very limited in Napoleon's France, would ultimately lead to his downfall, basically trying to force a blockade of British goods, and in turn they blockaded the, the goods that were blockaded into Britain. So it became a stalemate. But the English Navy was pretty strong and would shut down ships trying to enter Europe. So it became difficult for them to operate economically at certain points. So the continental system ultimately failed. So looking at your guided reading, basically Napoleon was actually he was a success. He was looking at evidence. He was what made him a popular figure. Well, he had quite a bit of success in the battlefield on the battlefield in the Revolution early on, and the French Revolution, as we've looked at, was a confusing time period, especially the reign of terror. Like, which side were you on? You know, if you're in Robespierre's time, if you're seen as being too sympathetic to the monarch, you could be executed. If you're seen, or you could be in trouble if you're seen as being too sympathetic to the revolution, or not sympathetic enough to the revolution, you could be in trouble. Or if you're seen as being too sympathetic to the king, that could cause you problems. So he's like, well, one might as well choose the side that's victorious. The side which devastates, loots, and burns. It is better to be eaten than to be eaten. The famous the famous Darwin quote. So basically, your answers here might vary as you're answering this question, but he's really more of an opportunist, quite a successful opportunist that cared more about success than principles and the winning side. And that the winning side is usually the side that's the most violent. So he would end up being, the violent and end up being ruthless to get his ways. So he was popular for his successes in the battlefield, especially, and looking at what made him a popular figure. So how did he build his image? Well, he deceived the public about his failures in battle. So his losses from his admirers, like spies, would help him hide those losses. And of course, he censors the press so that the the stories of his defeats do not get out. So that's helpful as well. Why would most people welcome Napoleon's decision to open up government jobs based on talent? So he establishes a system where government jobs are opened up based on a system of merit. And so that made a sort of a code. Another thing is Napoleonic code, and eliminates a state system where things are, so basically jobs are set up on merit. So during the monarchy, only aristocrats with those political ties, those people in the first and second estates, were given the best jobs. Now some of the bourgeoisie and the middle class were given opportunities to get into those jobs. So that would make some sense. At this point, if you're struggling to get some of this down or to correct some of your answers, I would suggest stopping before I move on as I'm going to move on to the next slide. So looking at some of his wars, he made a quote: "I grew up on the field of battle, and as a man and a man such as I cares a little for the life of a million men." So basically, he looks at the military as kind of a chess piece, strategizing. So that part of being successful in battle, strategizes sufficiently to prevent the loss of soldiers. So basically, he's trying to strategize to minimize losses, but mostly not because of caring necessarily about the men in particular, but just what the strength of the army is his main concern. So he uses a forceful diplomacy. He defeats foreign nations. So what does the text mean when it says uses forceful diplomacy? The term forceful diplomacy basically means he's defeating foreign nations and establishing new leaders that are sympathetic to his goals. The alliances with these countries as a result. So he's creating these alliances with these countries as a result. But these alliances were somewhat false because the new rulers did not reflect the will of their subjects, as would often happen in Europe. So let's take a look at the map. You've got in purple here, you've got all these alliances, but they might not necessarily reflect the rule of the will of the people being ruled by those subjects. And the same thing with these states, of course, that are dependent on France. And so he has a huge domination by his peak, but eventually he has to fight and lose battles with Russia, and eventually is exiled to an island, and then comes back, and then finally is defeated at Waterloo, which is where some of his battle sites are. So you see by the end really begins when he starts invading Russia, and his empire crumbles when this coalition of Britain, Prussia, Belgium, and the Netherlands stop the French army at Waterloo. And that's his final defeat. He tries to come back from being exiled the first time, and then he loses with an army and is finally exiled for good to St. Helena, an island, a lonely island in the South Atlantic. So going back to why things like ultimately the continental system, for example, did not work. And this was another part of his downfall, because British, as I was talking about earlier, Britain's powerful navy kept vital trade routes open to the Americas and India. So therefore, he was never able to break Britain. So he tried to blockade Britain, but they were still able to trade with the United States, with the colonies, with India, with their colony in India. So ultimately, the continental system did not work. It actually limited supplies coming into to France more than it limited supplies to Great Britain. And that was another reason that they would ultimately he was defeated. Now, the French Empire, basically, I'm going to need to finish this up on another slide. So I will do that. Coming up.